to the tops of the shoe.
Oh, I used to have that. I love that.
Yeah, I need it because I'm short and they're like 14-foot ceilings. Hi, everybody. I think we are live. At least I see that we are streaming live. So I'm going to go ahead and start us off. I am Jenna Blum. I am one of the co-founders of A Mighty Blaze, and I am thrilled, thrilled, thrilled to be here today with Dani Shapiro, who probably needs no introduction at all. But Dani, welcome to the Blaze. I'm going to introduce you anyway. Read your bio. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Jenna.
Oh,
What you all are doing is so amazing. I'm so glad to be a part of it.
Thank you. We're honored to have you. We're thrilled to have you. And I personally have been fangirling on Dani for so long. We have friends in common. I've seen her across a crowded Zoom. So I'm so excited to finally have her in my sights today to ask all of the nosy writer girl questions, fangirl questions. But meanwhile, for those of you who don't yet know Dani as well as you should, here is your bio. Dani Shapiro is the author of the instant New York Times bestselling memoir, Inheritance, which was published in January 2019 by Knopf. Her other books include the memoirs Hourglass. I'm not going to do this for all the books. Still Writing, which is on my shelves, Devotion, Slow Motion, and 5 novels, including Black and White and Family History. Along with teaching writing workshops around the world, Dani has taught at Columbia and NYU and is the co-founder of the Scienland Writers Conference in Positano, Italy, which is so amazing. In February of 2019, Dani also launched an original podcast, Family Secrets, in collaboration with iHeartMedia. An iTunes Top 10 podcast, the series features stories from guests like Dani who have uncovered life-altering and long-hidden secrets from their family's past. Who doesn't have a long-hidden secret? I would like to know. It must be such an amazing connection between you and other writers and readers. Dani also created a limited edition podcast in response to Corona called The Way We Live Now, which is also still available for you to listen to on iHeartRadio, although it is now defunct, right? Or not defunct, but it is ended.
Exactly.
And Dani lives with her family in Litchfield County, Connecticut, excuse me, where she's talking to us from today. And welcome, Dani. Thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jenna.
Okay, that's about as formal as we get around here. So let's talk about all the things. Your audience has been pinging me all day on my phone, on text, on Twitter, on Facebook, saying how much they love you and how much they're looking forward to this conversation. And I'd love to lead with Inheritance and the memoirs and the novels. You have such an oeuvre of work. And a body of work, 5 novels, several memoirs, the podcasts, essays. Do you have a favorite sort of flavor you like to write in? Memoir versus novel?
Mm, no, it's more like the the idea. I hesitate to even use the word idea because my books don't tend to come to me as ideas, but whatever glimmer of a beginning of something, an obsession or something that I want to follow, kind of comes to me with what it wants to be. And I remember when I wrote my first memoir, Slow Motion, I had written 3 novels prior to that, written and published 3 novels prior to that. And I was completely, well, no, actually, with Devotion, it was more of a conscious choice. I realized that my own autobiographical material had been sort of haunting my work and that I needed to look at it head on and write it from memory, write it from a place of trying to tell, a true story as opposed to writing it from imagination. But with the exception of Slow Motion, every other book of mine has sort of presented itself to me as, oh, this is, there's a woman lying in bed watching home movies. What happened to her? That's a novel. I'm doing yoga one day and suddenly the word devotion appears in front of me while I'm in tree pose. And I think, oh no, I think I'm going to be writing a spiritual memoir. And I think that that's the title. And I don't want to write a spiritual memoir, but that seems to be what is kind of I'm being like called to do by my creative process. So it's more like that and not if they're also so different. I mean, writing fiction is much more spacious in a lot of ways. And when I'm writing memoir, I miss that spaciousness of anything can happen. Grace Paley once said, If you're stuck in a story, just have somebody, just have somebody new walk through the door. And if you're writing memoir, you can't just have somebody new walk through the door. But when you're writing fiction, you can. But in memoir, there is a story that to some degree or another the writer already knows, and there's something that's very comforting in a way in that, like, I know what I'm writing about. um, Fiction's much more elusive, but also mm, a freer form, and podcasting is just a whole other thing. It's just a completely different mode of storytelling that I never even knew I was ever going to do until suddenly I was doing it.
Oh, so many responses and so many questions that I could unpack in absolutely every sentence of what you just said. It sounds as though there are sort of pros and cons to all of the different forms. Maybe that's too binary, but for me, writing fiction is a little terrifying because I have to impose some structure on it. And I just finished writing my first memoir about my ancient black lab, and I found it very comforting because it was a specific time period, a specific topic. I didn't have to invent anything. All I had to do was sort of unzip the truth and, just like show all of my emotional underwear. And that in itself is a sort of difficulty, but at least I knew what the task at hand was. Do you feel as though writing memoir is like easier in that way, harder in that way?
I think when a writer goes into it knowing this is what I'm doing, I'm writing a memoir about my ancient black lab, or in my case, I mean, after Slow Motion, I never thought I would ever write another memoir. I thought, well, that's the memoir. I mean, I had a story to tell and I told it, and it was really a story. People say about Slow Motion, it reads like a novel. It's because I write like a novelist, but it was a story that once I understood the structure of it, um, I, it sort of unfolded as this is the story of the year in which my father died and my mother was very nearly killed in this car accident that killed him, and the sort of rising up out of those ashes. That was, the way that, if I were going to distill it, like the way that the worst moment turns out to be the transformative moment. The way that I began to make meaning out of my life as a result of that family tragedy in my family. Um, I thought I was done with writing memoir. And then I went back to fiction. And then a bunch of years later, devotion materialized, and I realized, oh, this is about asking the big spiritual questions from inside my own life as a young mother, as someone whose kid was, asking me, what do you believe? What do you think happens when we die? And so everything about devotion had to hew to that principle. If it wasn't asking a question that had to do with belief and meaning, then it didn't belong in the book. And then a bunch of years later, when I realized that I wanted to write about marriage and time, and memory, and what it is to be in a long committed relationship, like how do we in hourglass, like how do we form ourselves? Can I just take you with me everywhere?
Yes, you can. I would
uh,
happily stand behind you and just do the Vanna White for your memoir. Yes.
um, if if it didn't hew, if I found myself kind of drifting off course, I knew what I had to come back to, which was I was writing about time and marriage and memory, and that was it. That was the window that I was looking through as I wrote that book. And so I think memoir is simpler in the sense that if ultimately our subject matter dictates our structure, which I think it does, right? In fiction and in memoir. But in fiction, when we begin, we have no idea. We don't know. There's so much we don't know. And there's so much we don't know in memoir, too, I've got to say. I mean, I recently said to someone who was thinking of embarking on a memoir, something I often say to my students, which is, if you know what happened, why tell the story? I can think of nothing more deadly, boring, than going into a room, closing the door, and like writing down what you already know. So there is discovery and the best part of memoir, I think, in reading and in writing is what we discover when we're writing it, but it's a different kind of discovery when writing fiction. I don't know about your process, but for me, I can be 200 pages into a novel in which there's a character who is in a coma, and I don't know how they got there yet. And I can think I do, and then be wrong, and then have to redraft and rethink, but I never become overly wedded to my to what I think happened, or I think I know why that woman is lying in bed watching home movies in the middle of the day, but let's find out. Let's find out why. And and because of that, a writer can write a long way into a piece of fiction before even a whole draft. I've done that without having what ultimately is the right structure.
Hmm. Hmm. I take it you don't write from an outline, or maybe you do.
I don't. Um, do you?
I do. But there's no right or wrong way to do this. I'm
No,
always
no.
fascinated with this. It's one of the things I emphasize so much in my classes. And then I make all of my novel students write outlines anyway, just so that they have a sort of a blueprint for what Melville called the long, deep sea voyage of writing a novel, just to get
Yeah.
your arms around what you know and don't know. But I know that for many writers, writing to the mystery, which is essentially what you're talking about, is the joy of the process, that exploratory origami of unfolding the story, right?
Yes, but at the same time, I think about outlining and I find myself, um, I've actually just gone back into a manuscript, the only manuscript I've ever put in a drawer. I put in a drawer 10 years ago. I put 120 really, really good pages in a drawer because I had backed myself into a corner and I had no idea how to get out of that corner. And they always stayed alive for me. They always had a heartbeat. I never thought I would go back to them. And I was cleaning out my office during the pandemic. And I suddenly, there was in my closet, there was the printed 120 pages of this manuscript. And I reread them and I saw my way back in. And I should say, I thought that I knew what the structure was back in 2010 or 2011 when I wrote those pages, and I was wrong. I had approached that subject matter with a kind of big idea about how it was going to go, and that big idea, I was sticking to it, and it was not going to let me stick to it, and I had no idea what to do with those pages without that big idea. So I've actually not outlining now, but it's a kind of form of outline. Like I've taken a notebook and I've dedicated that notebook to this novel in terms of writing about the work of the work, not the work itself,
Mhm.
and sort of tracing all of the characters because it takes place in multiple periods of time. And now I'm going to add another period of time and perhaps even another. And there's something that's very comforting, I would say, if anything is comforting about writing, um, that in being able um, to pin them down a little bit, to be like, well, this is how old they would be in this decade, and this is how old they would be in this decade, and maybe this happened to them, and maybe that's the thing. And so that is a form of outlining, I suppose. And also, I'm I'm about to uh, I've been asked to write an adaptation. Um, I think I can say this now. I don't see why not. I'm writing. I'm adapting Sue Miller's new novel, Monogamy, um,
Oh my God, I'm
for
so excited.
um, for Killer Films, which is a fantastic production company. And um, I know because my husband is a screenwriter. I know that it is utterly and completely impossible to write a screenplay without outlining it beat by beat. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see what creatively what going through that process is going to do, if anything, to my process of writing fiction.
This is so fascinating. And I should point out that our producer, Kimberly, who also runs our Authors Love Bookstore series, is losing her mind with joy right now in the Zoom chat because she loved that novel. And I did too. It's one of my top books of 2020, Sue Miller's Monogamy. And I had the great joy of talking to Elizabeth Berg on this show as well. And we were talking about that. And she said, I feel as though Sue Miller is like the crisp white button down shirt of authors. Like she's always elegant. She's always right. You always know what you're going to get. And I said, what a great simile. Are you like a great writer or something? So I'm thrilled to hear that. I think for me, there is always something comforting about knowing what I don't know and what I do know. And so the process that you're describing of writing about the writing and sort of putting your arms around that big, beautiful, amorphous orchestral process of writing a book, whether it's memoir or fiction. It's so nice just to have something written on a wall, like storyboarded in some way. Or when I say outlines, I have laundry lists of scenes on my wall. That's all they are. There are a lot of question marks. There are a lot of WTFs, in the middle of the outline until I figure out what to plug into that sort of switchboard. But
Well, that makes so much sense because I think sometimes writers starting out, when they hear outline, think, "Oh, I write this outline and then I'm married to it." Then
Mhm,
it's like this rigid thing that I have to stick to. Um, Whereas, the idea of it being kind of a course
mhm,
as opposed to um, like something that is solid, that is immutable. And also, for a bunch of years now, I've had a process with when did this start? I guess it started with devotion, with all of my books since devotion. So, devotion, still writing, Hourglass, and Inheritance, of beginning with index cards. And
mhm,
every time I have a thought pertaining to that book, and I always have them with me, I always have them in my purse. Um, I jot down just enough so that I'll remember what that thought is. I won't write it out because then for me that removes the urgency of it. But I'll write enough. I'll write the word Barcelona. I'll write the word, that thing Aunt Shirley said, or I'll write, in the case of Inheritance, I remember writing losing my father all over again on an index card. And what it does is it pins down the feeling or a bit of language or something that seems important. And then for me, it's like it's kind of a companion. It's like a friend. I have it with me all the time. And if I'm stuck and I don't know where I'm going next, I have my index cards. Or in the case of when I was writing Inheritance, I had, once I realized it was in 4 parts, the book would be structured in 4 parts. I had all these index cards and a bulletin board that I using sometimes, but mostly I had these piles, and I would start to shuffle them like I think this belongs in part 3. Oh no, maybe it belongs in part 2. So when I say that I don't outline, I suppose it's my own version. That's my own version of outlining.
mhm. We should call it something different, like organizing or pathfinding or something, just because outline sounds like something you did in seventh grade where you had the topic sentence and the Roman numerals, which I never really
That
grew
is
that way.
exactly.
But I always think about it in terms of what you described as what one of my writers at Grub Street does, has index cards and then on a clothesline in her apartment or along the hallway in her apartment sometimes, and she just walks through the apartment and switches them around. I have Post-its and I put them on the wall and they have like some arcane scribble on them that only I know what it means and sometimes forget. And I think one of the great things about doing it that way is if you happen to have a good, housekeeping crew or something, or somebody comes into your study, they'll have no idea what you're talking about on your
Right.
Post-its or index cards because it's just like the tree in the yard and you know what it
Exactly.
means and nobody else does.
Exactly. They're of use to no one but the writer whose imagination is pulling this whole thing together. There's
Mhm.
also, I remember years ago I was at Hedgebrook, which some people watching may know. It's a very small, very wonderful, all women writers colony on an island off the coast of Seattle called Whidbey Island, and it's only six writers in residence at a time, and once a year they have, or in the before times they would have a conference called Vortex, and they would invite 6 women writers to speak at it in exchange for a residency, and everyone had to give a keynote and do a little teaching and then be there for 3 weeks, and it was heaven. And I was there doing that one year, and with this cohort of amazing women who all became close friends, and we became close friends listening to each other's keynotes. I think everybody, I remember the first day listening to the keynotes and thinking, oh boy, like I have to bring my A game. Like I have to go back to my cabin tonight and like just do more, do better. And that first, one of those first keynotes was the writer Ruth Ozeki. And Ruth wrote a keynote about keeping a process journal. And I
Mm.
had never heard that term before. And I've kept one ever since. And a process journal is like simply a journal in which you only write about the process of that piece of work that you're doing, right? So it would be of interest to no one except for the writer. Like Ruth even read a little bit of her process journal when she was writing her novel, My Year of Meats. And, it had things in it like, I don't know if she's a Cassandra. Maybe she's a Wendy. But, Cassandra has 3 syllables, and that's like just like the kinds of stuff that we think about, but that our readers don't really want to know about that sausage making.
Mhm.
But a writer in the middle of a book is a writer in the middle of an obsession, and that, and it gives a place too for that kind of obsession to kind of be at play.
And it's such a kind thing to do to your friends too, because otherwise, I have email groups sometimes when I'm working, so that we have accountability buddies. While we're all working, we send emails to each other that contain exactly that sort of process journaling, that make, there's sort of hieroglyphics from the writer to herself, and none of the others really know what you're talking about. You're like, oh, the coat room sex scene, or whatever. Like, we know what that means. But I love the process journal idea. I have a stack of them in my attic from my
Mm.
book, like literally 11 canvas covered notebooks full of tiny little handwriting. The pages are all smoky because I smoked back then. And I remember bringing them to my first editor when she invited me for a meeting in her apartment in New York. And I showed up with 11 canvas covered notebooks full of my own, great importance and terror. And she just took one look at them and she said, "My God, you're neurotic." And then like sort of put them aside and just looked at the manuscript for a couple hours and then went to lunch. But I love that those are there. And every once in a while I fantasize that, like, your work could end up in the Smithsonian someday and the process journals will be there. And if somebody wants to know how Dani Shapiro wrote Inheritance and some of the things you were grappling with, or how did this one sentence that we all love come to be, we can look in the journals, and there
Mm-hmm.
are hieroglyphics
Mm-hmm.
showing how that bloomed. Is there a difference when you're keeping a process journal for memoir versus fiction versus podcast? Do you have a sort of a streamlined different process for each one now, or does each one teach you what it needs?
I think each form teaches me what it needs. So like for my podcast, I don't keep a process journal. I when somebody's coming on my show who has a body of work, I read the body of work and I take a ton of notes. I write directly into books. Some people feel that that's heretical, but I mean, to me, those are my best loved books or my most, I mean, I read so, um, it's a sign for me that I'm reading intensely and intently.
Like
So
underlining all over it, and all the pages are dog-eared, the
uh,
bottom. I love the
I
line.
love that. I
Mhm.
mean, so since many of my guests on Family Secrets are writers, that's a big part of my process with the podcast. And I then write out a kind of um, like blueprint for myself of things I want to get to in the conversation, um, or passages that I might want that person to read that I might use in the show. But that's it. That's the kind of preparation that I do. Um, and
I did the same. I don't know if you can see this, but probably not. But okay, this is like so not working. But it's like, this is my process
oh,
thing, right? So I
I
kind of
love
wrote all
that.
the questions that I was hoping that I could entice you to answer, and then color coded them
Oh
because
wow,
neurosis.
quite erotic. I love that.
Oh,
I love that. No, that I say to my students, there are two kinds of, I ask for a show of hands. I say, how many of you wake up in the morning and make your bed right away? And it's like, okay, so when it comes to writers, there are bed makers, like instant bed makers, and then people who can actually leave the house with their bed unmade without like twitching. And I have one student who I adore who raised her hand and she said, I make my bed in hotels. And I was like, okay, you win. you,
Wow.
you win. But I get up in the morning and I make my bed and like right away. And it sounds like you do too. And that goes along also with being the kind of writer process wise who needs a certain kind of routine, who wants things color coded, who has a relatively organized, sort of atmosphere, or who, I don't know if you can see this. Yeah, you can see this. Like, this
Yes.
is my calendar. And during these last months when everything changes all the time, I write things down on post-its and then put them into my calendar, because if I have to change them, I don't want the messiness of things all crossed out. That's just more than I can bear right now. So, and then there are other writers who don't need that at all and who can just work anywhere at any time, can work in the middle of the night, can work on the subway, can work on the go. I'm not like that.
I'm not either. My outlines, I have 11 outlines probably for each book, and I'm not exaggerating. And I do cross out things that are no longer in the book. I add things in, but every time I do that, I have to write a new outline, which is why I have 11 outlines. And
Yeah.
I think where I am in the process determines whether or not I am one of the writers who can get up and not make her bed. There's probably, maybe 5 days for each book in my life where I'm so into it. And it's always by the end when the engine is like really on and I know the characters really well and I'm almost done, that I'm writing all the time. And then
Yeah.
I would write on the subway, write on the park bench, write on the, whatever, in the refrigerator cooking, just because it's so, the faucet is
That's the
on.
best part.
It's the best part. Oh my gosh, but you have to earn that with the other 360 days when,
That's,
you're kind of slogging through and making the color coded outlines. I have a question, as I'm sure many of our audience members do, but I also have this question as a personal question for myself. So the memoir that I wrote just recently is the first one I ever wrote, and I have not yet been out in the world with it. And intelligently, I wrote about somebody who's a dog and b no longer here, so he can't be like, you wrote me wrong. But what is it like to expose yourself is not quite the right thing, but to be so vulnerable out in the world with a book about your life, a book about your life story? Like, what is the waterline between guarding your own privacy and vulnerability and then giving yourself to readers in this way?
I've thought a lot about that because I've I've been a memoirist for so long now, 20 years, that it's become, something that I just kind of accept about my life, that people think that they know everything about me, and will actually say that. Um, and we'll use the word like, you must feel so exposed, or you must feel like I know everything about you. And I don't feel that way. I don't feel exposed. And I don't feel, um, I in certain ways, I feel like writing fiction is more exposing
Mm,
because we're actually not fully conscious of what we're revealing in our language and metaphor and and storytelling and themes. And I write in still writing, theme is just a fancy literary term for obsession. We don't choose what obsesses us. And so I think if you read the body of work of a fiction writer, any fiction writer, um, and if you're trained on thinking about that, you learn a great deal about that writer,
mm,
and what makes them tick. Memoir is actually it's in many ways an act of control. I mean, you chose exactly what to write about your ancient black lab, and and I, even in a memoir as close to the bone as Inheritance, I was choosing exactly what to write. I wasn't like, just whenever somebody asks me about this, I'll say, I didn't publish my journal. You
mm.
didn't read my journal. Um, there's so much control.
Sorry,
Oh,
my puppy. I don't know what he's barking at. Sorry.
um, so it I the tricky thing about memoir is that you are involving other people, or in your case, a dog who's gone. That was very wise. Um, but I've had to be conscious of times when I'm involving, or I'm writing about someone who's living and who um, didn't ask to be written about.
Mhm.
Um, and even those who are gone. I mean, I felt a great responsibility to my parents in writing Inheritance, because I was telling the story of a secret that they kept all their lives,
Mhm.
and a secret that they fully intended to go to the grave with, and did. And I was the secret, so I felt like I had every right in the world to write that story. I didn't feel guilty about it, and I didn't feel like I shouldn't. But it also was complicated because, I remember when the book was about to come out, I had a piece just before publication. I had a piece about an aspect of the book in Time magazine, and on the day that it was published, it was the number one most read, like on Apple News, like the number one most read story that day in America. And there was a picture of my dad and me in it. And I was a very small child, and it's a very like sweet, warm, loving, beautiful photograph that really captures our relationship. But I had a pang, that day, of thinking, God, if that young father could have had a crystal ball and looked into the future and seen that 50 years later, that little girl would have grown up to have discovered the truth and then written a book about it that was being read by so many people. There's a pang there. Um, but by the same token, if writing is an act of radical empathy, there's also a way in which I feel like I got to know both of my parents better and have greater stores of compassion for each of them through having written that book. So there's so much layered stuff that goes into it. I do think that it's really important for the writer to consider all of that. To think about it deeply. I think the dangerous ones are the ones who don't think about it.
Mhm.
It's like thinking about it is almost its own form of protection to some degree. Like, what is the ethical thing to do here? What is the moral thing to do here? Am I writing out of revenge? Am I settling a score? Is this a vendetta? Those are all really bad reasons, both morally and ethically. And my favorite is that they don't make for good literature. They just don't. Books that come from that place are never good, ever.
Yes, and this I should hold up Inheritance again, which if you haven't read yet, you should obviously buy and read and buy many copies because it almost holidays and everybody needs to read this. It's such a I remember sitting with my friend Sarah DeVello, who runs our mystery series on the Blaze, and she was telling me about Inheritance, I think right when it was coming out. She was like, the story is so incredible. And Dani Shapiro is this great memoir writer and novelist, and she is found out that her parents were telling her all along that she was Jewish and she's not at the result of a DNA test. So you guys, it's such a good book. I feel as though the epidermis has many layers, right? So as a memoirist, your job for yourself and for other people is to figure out how many of those are you going to peel back. There has to still be some protection, and usually it's your job to expose yourself most of all, maybe other people like degrees less, but I will find out. Did you ever have, when working through the editorial process, did you ever have anybody say, Dani, I really need you to reveal more about this. Like, you need to dig deeper here. You need to peel back more of those layers. And what was your reaction?
Sure. I mean, I think that's almost inevitably a part of the process. And I mean, one example that comes to mind is when I was writing Hourglass, which is my memoir about marriage using my marriage. That's me and my husband, by the way.
It is,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, it was our wedding day.
No, I
Um,
love this photo, but also notice it's like it's you on the cover and he is shown from the back. Like I feel
yes.
like that's such a visual metaphor for what memoirists do.
Yeah, I sent my editor a bunch of photographs, and that was her choice, and the art director's choice, and it was so right,
Mhm.
and absolutely a metaphor. But my husband's a writer and filmmaker, and he's my first reader. And we sometimes, when I'm really deep inside a book, I will often read to him from it. I feel that safe with him as he's got my back, and he's a really, really good writer, and he's a really good editor, and he always makes me better. And so I was reading Hourglass to him, and there was a point where he said, I think you're actually really not being hard enough on me right there. Like you're not kind of interrogating this as deeply as you need to. And that moment between us went right into the book. Like I mean, it was kind of a little meta, but that he was less concerned with protecting himself or our marriage or looking good. Like what it was, he said, I'm a nice guy, but you know, you're not being hard enough on me here. And so that's one example. And then another example is when I was writing Slow Motion, my editor at the time, after reading the first draft, that was pretty close. It was pretty close to being, I mean, it was, there were no structural issues. She said, I just feel like there are places you need to tamp this down, like the way a butterfly net becomes tamped down. There are places where it needs a bit more weight here, a bit more weight there. And I remember that. That was Deb Futter, who was my editor at the time, just thinking that that's a really, yeah, Deb's amazing. And it's a really wonderful um, way of thinking about 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 deepening, because it's not like deepening. I mean, you've got a problem if the whole thing needs deepening, right? But it's more like these little places of you could go farther here, you could go farther here.
Right. And in fiction, I try to write from inside somebody else. But at memoir, I feel as though it's a surface process and then you sort of drill down. So I think that's totally right. There are places where I was trying to be feather light because of other people's situations or feelings, and not wanting to. Any memoir about a dog is really about the person who owns the dog, like not really wanting to be, uncomfortably confessional or like what is the line there. But the feedback that I have gotten from my editor, who's amazing, the amazing Sarah Nelson, would say things like, I need you to press a little bit more here. I need to know more about your mom here or here. And so your feedback on your own process is so invaluable because I think, oh, good, I'm not the only one who elided. I feel as though when you're writing memoir, your allegiance is to the story, to yourself, to other people, mostly to the truth, but there are various pressures and weights you can put on that story.
Right, and we can't always see that for ourselves initially.
Mhm.
um, Another really useful um, thing that I learned, and also it came from a conversation with Michael, my husband, was there are phrases, and this really happens in memoir, I think mostly. Like in fiction, we often end up having ticks that we can't see. Like I remember another famous Deb Futter line where she's like, "There are a lot of people in this novel wearing bathrobes." Like, or word repetitions. I once had an amazing copy editor on my novel Black and White who wrote to me really late in the game, like almost at the point where it couldn't have been changed. They said, "I had a hunch and I did a word search and you used the word muffled 11 times in this book." That would have been terrible. But the narrative itself was centered around a character who was somewhat muffled to herself. So the word muffled ended up kind of, it was a tick. It just ended up in there. But in memoir, especially when we're hitting upon something that's hard, how in life, um, if we if there's something that we have to explain about ourselves, like to somebody that we're meeting for the first time, or you're on a first date with somebody, or whatever it is, you kind of want to skim over that thing. You just want to sit. Like with me, I have two things like that I know of. Maybe more now, but the two are, um, my parents were in a car accident. My father was killed. My mother had 80 broken bones. Um, one. I don't even know if, I mean, was it 80? Was it 79? Was it 92? It became a thing I could say and not feel anything about
Mm.
because I would have that language. Or my son was very sick when he was an infant. He's completely 1,000% fine, but he was very sick when he was an infant. And if I needed to tell somebody that, I would say, yeah, he had a rare disease, 7 out of a million babies stricken with this disease, rare disease, only 15% survive. And I could say that, and it cost me nothing.
Mhm.
Right? And that's good. That's how we get through life and first dates and new friendships. If we felt everything every time we said it, we'd have to like crawl under our beds and maybe never get out again. But in writing, it can't be that that I think of it as like a little skid, right? Like, that those places where we just aren't going to stay there and then drill deep. And that's the job of a great editor or a really good early reader to say, right here, you're hiding. Right here, I need to know more.
And a really good editor like Deb or like Sarah will know the tips and tells of a writer, especially if you work with her long enough, you'll know there are certain words that are certain places where she's going to try and be evasive, not because we're intending to be evasive, but because there's something that we can't see. In a way, it's interesting. We were talking about memoir in some ways being less confessional than fiction. I think that's true. There's a sort of a hat trick to it where you're building like an invisible wall around an experience to contain the experience. And the wall is really these words. So when you're saying, oh, my son was stricken with a rare disease, 1 in 7 million, it's something you've taught yourself to say through writing or through speaking. And that's kind of what a memoir does, is it builds the wall around that experience so then you can then talk about it. But in fiction, my therapist would say the same thing. She reads my fiction and she's like, this is about your mom. And I'm like, oh, I thought so. I thought I was writing about a Holocaust survivor, but boom, it's my mom. So yeah, it's super interesting.
I'm so glad you said that, and that's so exactly right. And I mean, I remember when Black and White was about to come out, a novel about a photographer and her daughter. I wrote an essay for Vogue, the kind of thing that you do to support a publication. And as I was writing it, it was about my mother and her taking photographs of me, like my mother and the camera and me. And I was very briefly and sort of accidentally a child model, and I was the Kodak Christmas poster child. And I'm like, I just had spent 3 years writing black and white, and I thought, oh, my mother took pictures. I was a child who was constantly behind the lens, in front of the lens of her mother's camera. Oh, and like I, if I had entered into trying to write a novel about that, thinking, well, I was a child who was always in front of her mother's lens, so I'm going to write a novel that's kind of loosely based on Sally Mann and her relationship with her. It wouldn't have been a good book
Mhm.
because I would have been entering into it with too much consciousness about what I was doing. I wouldn't have been in that kind of dream state that, outline or no, that's where we go and where we have to be, to be able to like really, really make that magic happen. But in memoir, in the end, I feel like I have this bookshelf full of memoirs that I've written that are like slivers of my life held between the covers of a book.
Mhm.
Like, this is what I knew in 2010 when Devotion came out. And this is what I knew in 1998 when Slow Motion came out. And I just had the experience this summer of recording the audiobooks of Slow Motion and Still Writing, which were the only two of my memoirs that had not been made into audiobooks, and PRH bought them. And so I went into this little booth to record them. And I'm in this situation reading Slow Motion, which is a book that I wrote in 1998 when I was in my early 30s, about my childhood and my early 20s, from a place of being in my 50s and being closer to the age that my parents were when my father died, with a son who's close to the age that I was when I was the world's biggest fuck up. And like, it was like worlds colliding, worlds within worlds within worlds. But as I was reading it aloud in this little booth, I also had to stop several times because I realized, my God, on some level, I knew that there was a secret. I knew, like, I didn't know consciously, but I was writing toward something that was a mystery that was driving my work, and it's there on the page, but I couldn't possibly have um, known it or seen it, if that makes any sense.
It makes total sense, and it's fascinating. My paternal grandmother had a bathroom that was mirrors within mirrors within mirrors within mirrors. It was, the 60s when she built it, and it was very chic at the time. And I was fascinated with it when I was a child, to see the infinities of myself and her while she was brushing my hair. And that's what
Mm.
your
Yeah.
experience reminds me of, is this sort of infinities of time that, I mean, this is what your books are about. This is what Hourglass is about, the infinities of time that exist in different ways and also simultaneously. And the experience of writing can be like that, especially I feel like with fiction. With memoir, I feel as though it is a little bit more pinned down in a sense, but with fiction, you have to explore and discover what it is you're writing about. And in some ways, I think if you're lucky, you don't know. It's just like, you know what your intent was, but then there's just sort of a magic to it that readers take away from it, that they sense, and that's the infinities of the mirrors. I have so many more questions. I've already kept you for a while, but I have a couple questions I must ask, and one of them was, speaking to what you were just talking about. I often ask writers this obnoxious question, which is, what is your favorite among your books? Which I am told is like asking, what is your favorite child? And when I was thinking about your body of work, instead of, what came to mind for me instead of what's your favorite is there one that you're nostalgic for, the experience of writing?
Mm, that's such a great question. Um, yeah, it's actually a novel of mine that's out of print, um, called Picturing the Wreck.
Mm.
That was my third novel. And it was the novel that I really started to figure out how to write a novel. Well, I mean, you figure out how to write every novel by writing that novel. It's like climbing a mountain. Just because you've climbed one doesn't mean you know how to climb, and you don't know the terrain of another one. But it was the deepest act of imagination in my life at that point. And it was narrated in the point of view of a 64-year-old man, Holocaust survivor, psychoanalyst, and filled with regret about a long ago mistake that cost him a lot. And his name was Solomon Grossman, and I loved Solomon Grossman. I didn't know Solomon Grossman. I had never met Solomon Grossman, but I entered his world to the degree, and it was a really tough novel. I mean, I'm nostalgic for how it turned out, but I'm not nostalgic for the process of getting there. I mean, that's the book I was thinking about when I said sometimes you write an entire novel before you find the structure. I
Mhm.
mean, if you do what I did, which was I just thought every meandering thought that Solomon had was interesting, and I wrote a 600-page draft, which Deb Futter, again, who hasn't been my editor in years, but um, she was my editor for a number of books. I remember walking into her office, and she had read my first draft of Picturing the Wreck, and she held up my manuscript like this, and she went, "Can you believe you wrote all this?" And I like, it's a good thing that her office like windows are hermetically sealed, because I would have I mean, I just was like, oh my God, I'm so screwed. And I had to figure out the novel that was inside that novel, the novel that wanted to come out that was inside that novel. And ultimately, the novel that wanted to come out was completely restructured 320-page novel, that I I remember the feeling. I remember being in Sag Harbor in a rented house by myself in August of whatever year that was, and finishing the book. And also, I wonder if you've ever had an experience like this. At a certain point, I realized that in order to accomplish what I hoped to, I was going to have to do something really, really risky,
Hmm.
like really narratively risky. And I didn't know if I could pull it off. And I wasn't going to know if I could pull it off until I actually got to the end and either pulled it off or didn't. I didn't know if it was pull off a bull. I didn't know. And I remember sitting at this desk on the second floor of this house by myself in Sag Harbor and realizing that it was going to work. Like it was going to work in the sense of to like that what I was hoping to accomplish, I would accomplish, whether anyone else agreed or not. That what I wanted to do, I was going to be able to do. That feeling and that thing that you're describing of like those, those 5 days where you don't make your bed, like that feeling of when the whole world starts acting in concert with
Yeah.
your everything you eat, everything you overhear, every breeze, every step you take is somehow feels like the universe is supporting your vision to come to the end of this thing. And that's the best feeling in the world. And that doesn't happen in the same way with memoir.
Mm. No, it doesn't. I'm so glad you said that. I literally got goosebumps when you said that, because I remember toward the end of my first book, which was a 3-year undertaking that I wrote, totally on my own without any guidance. Although I did have friends who listened to me talk about Nazis for 3 years, like they were really good friends. But I remember getting toward the end of that book and being in this almost fever dream state and walking across the Boston Common to go teach a class at Grub Street Writers, and the cherry blossoms were all falling, these beautiful cherry blossoms. And I was so in the head of the book and the main character that I was thinking, I have to put the way the light is hitting the trees. In the end of this book, it's like a gold net in the trees, and it's so beautiful. And all she could think about is how life is a frosted cake made of worms. Like, this is what I was walking around thinking. But like everything I saw, no matter how beautiful, went in the service of the psychology of these people whose skins I had been living in for three
Yeah.
years. And it was
Yeah.
such a magical, I don't even know how to describe it. It was such a visceral moment where you feel like I've earned being in somebody else's skin. And those are,
Yeah.
the memories that I'll probably have as a very old, knock on wood, I should get that age, a very old lady writer, like walking through the common when I was 28, feeling like I was living in the skin of somebody who was alive in 1945. Like, those are the magic moments. They're so fantastic. I just gave myself goosebumps again. Like,
You gave me goosebumps. That's it. And then that's earned. Like when that happens, it's not, I think sometimes people think I'm just going to jump into the skin of another person.
mm,
Um, and, and, and that'll be fun and easy. And it's not, it's that beautiful thing of kind of, um, creating a world, really creating it, and then stepping into it and having it be as real or more real than your own world.
more real. I mean, I love that. And it's not that I don't like my world. I do like my world, but just earning that experience of living in somebody else's world is really amazing. And that's what we're privileged to do. Memoir does feel different to me. I'll let you know on the other side of that, putting it out in the world, I feel as though it's almost like a PSA in some ways, to like, take something that has happened to you that feels important or valuable in some way and give it to other people and hope that they find it helpful, is my feeling. But it's a little bit different because you've already lived that thing, and
Mhm.
your job is to render it accurately and convincingly, I guess. What I really want to read about Solomon Grossman now. I know everybody's out there frantically Googling, like, I need to find this book. I'm gonna get it on eBay.
leave it to me to like choose the book that's, like probably there are 5 copies on Abe's books that people can find, but yeah.
We're all going to fight. We're all going to throw elbows for it. So one of our viewers wanted to know the book that you took out of the drawer that you wrote in 2010/2011, and now you found your key back into it. Is that something we can anticipate seeing? Maybe.
I'm not going to jinx it. I mean, I think I think I'm now figuring it out, and what I need to do is write my way back into it and see if I'm see if it has the magic that I'm hoping it does. But yeah, that is my intention. Yeah.
Is that, are you working on one thing at a time? Do you do that? We've talked so wonderfully about process. I didn't ask if you sort of play, jazz with one hand and classical with the other.
I'm going to have to learn to do that now because, um, inheritance was such a, uh, it was, it really feels like the kind of the end of a certain body of work. I was digging for something, and then I found it. I didn't know what I was digging for, and then my shovel hit the box,
Mhm.
and there it was. And so I've been thinking a lot over this, and the book necessitated a tremendous amount of travel, and I think I did something like 40 cities, or if like I was on the road for well over a year and only stopped because of the pandemic. I was on my way to Paris and Sydney and all these other places that would have been fun to go to. But I was also like a spinning top, a spinning promotional top for that book, and I knew that the book had changed me, and I needed to really get very quiet to see how. Um, and then there's often a lot of pressure to have the next book, when a book's been successful, somehow follow up on that book, and there's no follow up on that book. And I kept on starting to feel this real kind of drumbeat of, I want to go back to fiction. It's been a really long time, and is that a crazy thing to do? I'll say this to everybody who's listening. I've never once made a decision in my entire writing life that was, this is a good idea, like this is a commercial thing to do. This is going to build my brand audience. Never done it. Not capable of doing it. Like, it's just not, that's not how I work. And so this feels very organic for me, this going back to these pages. It's not forced. It's not like, ooh, I've got pages in a drawer, let me do something with them. Not at all. It's more like there's a very surprising um, element to all this, that they needed to sit there for 10 years, and 10 years needed to go by so I would know what the next part of it was. It's like kind of a living thing. But at the same time, I have other work to do. I have this adaptation to write. I have a fifth season of a podcast to produce, and also the podcast is being turned into a fictional TV series, which I'm going to be involved in.
Oh my God.
So I have a like I'm it's what I want to learn how to do is how to compartmentalize while fully being 1,000% in whatever it is that I'm doing while I'm doing it. And that remains to be seen. I may need to do the adaptation, do nothing but that, and just put this on a burner until I can give it all of my. I've never been able to do more than one thing at a time. So
Yeah,
we shall see.
I'm a single tasker also, that can't. I could do a memoir and work with the blades, but I couldn't do a novel and work with the blades, I don't think, because it is so consuming and so immersive.
Yeah,
I'm so excited. We're actually, believe it or not, we're actually coming up on an hour, and I promised you that I would not keep you for 6 hours, although I would love to. But I wanted to ask about the podcast to series issue. Like, that's not even an issue, like the situation, the celebratory situation. Who has picked it up? We want to know. And can you talk a little bit about that? And then also, what are you reading and what are you gifting people for
mm,
holidays this year?
great. So just briefly, in terms of the podcast, it's uh, a wonderful production company, who I won't mention because they haven't announced it yet, but it's with ABC TV. No, 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 it's with ABC, which ABC Studios. So, but it'll be a fictional podcast, and I will be pretty involved with it. So I'm excited about that.
So
Um,
exciting.
and oh, and Inheritance is being developed as a film as well. So, yeah.
So
So,
are you doing any
and
of the
that's. Hmm?
are you doing the screenwriting for that or
I
no?
am not doing the screenwriting for that, and it's being developed by Killer Films, who I am writing Monogamy for, the adaptation. But they're fantastic. They did Still Alice and Carol and Boys Don't Cry. They're just amazing producers. So I could not be more thrilled. Um, as for gifting, a novel that I'm hugely championing this season came out during the pandemic. It's been so difficult for books that have come out during this time, and it's a first novel by a writer named Meredith Hall. Its title is
Hmm.
Beneficence, and it is magnificent. It is utterly magnificent. Meredith wrote a memoir about 20 years ago called Without a Map that got a lot of attention at the time, about um, putting up a child for adoption as a teenager and being shunned by her community. It's a very, very good book, and she's a beautiful writer. But Beneficence reads like, um, it has a sonorous quality to it. It reads like Wallace Stegner or Willa Cather, like kind of this, like, it's a family saga, and it's beautiful, and it is not getting nearly as much. I mean, people should be standing up and like receiving it and reviewing it, and it's just one of those rare books. And so that's and she's a woman in her mid 60s, which is also such an instructive, wonderful story that a first novel, could come out, in this, youth obsessed and kind of like what's the next shiny thing kind of culture that could happen.
Thank you. I love it. Beneficence, everybody. And I know that our people are putting the links in the chat so that you can buy Beneficence. I feel a bit chagrined that we didn't feature her on the Blaze, but now I'm going to go after her, like hammer
Good,
and tongs, and be like, Meredith, come on the Blaze. Come,
good,
come sit on
good.
my lap. We're going to feature your book. Thank you for that. Somebody wanted to know also in the chat when my memoir is coming out, and I can't really say that yet because it needs to be like all the contract needs to be T's crossed, I's dotted, but stay tuned and I will tell you, but it will be in 2021. So yay. Meanwhile, everybody buy all of Dani's books, like all of them, including the Solomon Grossman one, which I also am going to buy, but Hourglass and Inheritance and Slow Motion and Still Life and Black and White. There's so many amazing Dani books that you can buy and give to people for holidays this year. Books are the best gifts. Happy Hanukkah, by the way.
Happy Hanukkah.
Yes, thank you. And thank you all so much for watching. Dani, thank you so much for spending so much time with me this evening. I could talk to you about writing for hours. Like I
Same here.
chat.
I
Thank you.
hope I hope we get a chance to do that in person over a cup of tea one day.
Please, from your mouth to God's ears, as they
Yeah,
say. That would be
yeah.
great. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thanks, Jenna.